The ocean has always held silence. Ships cross it every day, carrying families, travelers, and strangers who expect to arrive at their destinations. Yet not everyone does. Some vanish in the night. Some leave behind only belongings, placed neatly as though they intended to return. Others are last seen on grainy cameras, walking alone on empty decks. These disappearances leave no clear answers. They exist only as fragments: an abandoned handbag, a missing name on a passenger list, a final phone call with no continuation. The sea takes what it takes, and what remains is uncertainty. Tonight, we look at the mysteries of passengers and crew who boarded ships but never disembarked. Their stories are not conclusions, but questions. Questions that continue to follow the wake of these vessels long after the journey's ended. Join us as we step into the quiet waters where lives slipped away. The disappearance of George Smith. In July 2005, a honeymoon cruise aboard the brilliance of the seas became the setting for one of the most enduring maritime mysteries in recent history. George Allen Smith IV, a 26-year-old from Greenwich, Connecticut, vanished during the night as the ship sailed through the Aegean Sea between Greece and Turkey. His disappearance left behind fragments of evidence, conflicting testimony, and unanswered questions that remain unresolved nearly 2 decades later. George Smith and his new wife, Jennifer Hagel, had boarded the ship in Barcelona for a 12-day voyage through the Mediterranean. Photographs from the first days show the couple smiling, blending into the normal rhythm of meals, excursions, and quiet evenings at sea. To their families, it was a celebration of marriage. To investigators later, it became a series of timestamps in a case that never closed. On the evening of July 4, the couple spent time in the ship's casino. Surveillance footage captured them gambling, speaking with other passengers, and drinking. Witnesses later described the two as cheerful but noted heavy drinking. Afterward, they were seen with a group of young men, some of them from Russia, who became central figures in the investigation. These men, Gregory Rosenberg, his cousin Zachary, and their friend Rusty Kaufman, were among the last to be seen with George alive. Their movements in the hours that followed became a critical focus. By the early hours of July 5, events grew less clear. According to testimony, George and Jennifer returned to their cabin at different times. Jennifer was later found unconscious in a corridor, reportedly after being left outside the wrong stateroom by crew members who thought she was drunk. She was guided to another cabin and allowed to sleep. George, however, was never seen again. Morning revealed a disturbing scene. Passengers in a stateroom directly below the Smiths' balcony noticed a large bloodstain on the canvas roof of their own balcony area. The reddish smear stretched nearly 6 feet across the white surface, visible to anyone looking upward. When crew members entered George's cabin, they found more traces of blood inside. His bed appeared slept in, his wallet, cell phone, and clothing were still in place, but George himself was gone. The official theory suggested that George had fallen from his balcony, but inconsistencies fueled speculation. The railing was approximately 42 inches high, considered difficult to topple over accidentally. Passengers nearby reported hearing loud noises and possible arguments in the night. Some later testified they heard the sound of furniture being moved. Others claimed to have overheard men bragging about being with George before his disappearance. Investigators looked closely at the young men last seen with him. They admitted they had been in the Smiths' cabin, but denied involvement in any violence. One of them, Josh Askin, gave statements to both ship security and later to the FBI. He claimed George was heavily intoxicated and that the group left him alone in the cabin during the early morning hours. His account was never proven or disproven. The investigation stretched across multiple jurisdictions. The brilliance of the seas was registered in the Bahamas. The incident occurred in international waters near Turkey and Greece. George was an American citizen. This overlap left confusion over who had authority. The FBI became involved once the ship docked in Piraeus, Greece. Greek police also interviewed witnesses. The Bahamian authorities technically held jurisdiction, but delegated most of the work to US investigators. Despite hours of testimony, forensic sampling, and cooperation between agencies, no charges were filed. Jennifer Hagel later accepted a financial settlement from Royal Caribbean Cruises, reportedly worth $1.1 million, in exchange for ending legal claims against the company. In her statement, she explained that the agreement would allow her to honor George's memory while also focusing attention on passenger safety. George's parents, George and Maureen Smith, rejected the settlement, calling it a way to silence further inquiry. They believed strongly that foul play was involved, and they openly criticized both the cruise line and the handling of the case. Media coverage grew intense. CNN, Dateline, NBC, and the New York Times all devoted lengthy features to the case. Broadcasts repeated the images of the blood-stained canopy, the blurred security footage of the casino, and interviews with family members. The mystery of a healthy, newly married man vanishing from a locked stateroom balcony captured international attention. Reporters described it as a honeymoon gone dark. One lingering detail that investigators could never dismiss was the blood. Forensic reports described its distribution across multiple surfaces, including inside the cabin and along the balcony. It did not appear consistent with a single accidental fall, yet without witnesses, a confession, or recovery of a body, the circumstances could not be resolved. Searches of the Aegean Sea in the days that followed produced no results. George's remains were never located. In subsequent years, congressional hearings on cruise ship safety used the Smith case as a key example of the industry's gaps in security and transparency. The Cruise Vessel Security and Safety Act of 2010 required cruise ships docking at US ports to maintain improved surveillance systems, better reporting procedures, and greater cooperation with federal law enforcement. George's family testified in Washington, emphasizing the need for protections that had not existed during his voyage. The men last seen with George were never charged. Some gave multiple interviews over the years, maintaining their innocence. For George's parents, the lack of resolution meant living in what they called an endless trial with no verdict. His sister Bree Smith stated publicly that there are people who know what happened, but they have never spoken. The night of July 4 into July 5, 2005 remains a void in the record. A young man celebrating his marriage vanished on calm waters under clear skies. The ship sailed on, serving breakfast, docking at ports, and continuing excursions. Passengers walked corridors lined with polished brass and soft carpet, but for one family, the voyage had ended with silence and a question that time has not answered. The vanishing of Amy Lynn Bradley. In March 1998, the Rhapsody of the Seas, a Royal Caribbean cruise liner, sailed through the Caribbean on a 7-day voyage. Among the passengers was Amy Lynn Bradley, a 23-year-old from Chesterfield County, Virginia. She had boarded the ship with her parents, Ron and Ivor, and her younger brother, Brad. For the family, it was meant to be a time of rest and celebration before Amy began a new job. For investigators later, it became a case defined by silence, unexplained sightings, and a mystery that stretched across decades. Amy was described as independent, athletic, and cautious. She played basketball in college, worked as a lifeguard, and was confident in the water. Friends and family described her as a person who disliked unnecessary risks. She had several distinctive tattoos: a Tasmanian devil spinning a basketball on her shoulder, a sun on her lower back, a Chinese symbol on her right ankle, and a green gecko on her navel. These markings would later become central in reports of possible sightings. Before the cruise, Amy expressed some hesitation about travelling at sea, a quiet unease that she could not fully explain. On the evening of March 23, 1998, 998, the Bradleys spent time in one of the ship's lounges. They listened to live music performed by Blue Orchid, a Caribbean band popular with passengers. Amy was seen dancing with band members and chatting with other travelers. Photographs and video from that night show her smiling, her dark hair loose, blending into the crowd of passengers enjoying the evening. Shortly after 1:00 a.m., the family returned to their cabin. Amy and her brother Brad sat together for a while on the small balcony, talking before going to sleep. At approximately 5:30 a.m., Amy's father, Ron, awoke and saw his daughter asleep on the balcony chair. Less than half an hour later, when he rose again, she was gone. Her shoes, cigarettes, and lighter were still there. The sliding glass door remained slightly open. No sound of a fall had been heard. No commotion had disturbed the cabin. Amy had disappeared in the narrow window of dawn. That morning, the ship was preparing to dock in Curacao. The Bradleys immediately reported Amy missing to crew members, but the response was measured and slow. Passengers were allowed to disembark for shore excursions before a ship-wide search was conducted. Hours were lost before investigators began checking rooms, interviewing witnesses, or searching nearby waters. The Bradley family later argued that this delay might have allowed someone to remove Amy from the ship undetected. Royal Caribbean staff and local authorities in Curacao searched cabins, decks, and surrounding waters. Divers checked beneath the ship, and helicopters scanned the area, but nothing was found. Unlike many other cruise disappearances, there was no evidence of Amy falling overboard. She was a strong swimmer, and no clothing or objects were recovered in the sea. Investigators began to consider the possibility of abduction. In the months and years that followed, reports of sightings surfaced across the Caribbean. Some witnesses in Curacao claim they saw a young woman matching Amy's description being hurried off the ship into a waiting car on the day she vanished. A taxi driver reported seeing a woman like Amy near a beach, looking dazed. In 1999, a U.S. Navy petty officer stated that he had encountered a woman in a Curacao brothel who identified herself as Amy Bradley and begged for help. He hesitated, fearing for his safety, and later reported the incident. His testimony was included in FBI files. In 2005, photographs circulated online in an escort advertisement showed a woman with tattoos resembling Amy's. The image was analysed by the family and investigators. Some experts agreed that the tattoos matched Amy's unique designs, while others were less certain. Regardless, the photos brought the case back into public attention. The Bradleys pursued every lead. They hired private investigators, travelled to the Caribbean, and worked closely with the FBI. They appeared on Oprah, America's Most Wanted, and other national programs. A reward of up to $250 was offered for information leading to Amy's return. Despite these efforts, none of the sightings were confirmed, and no verified trace of her has ever been recovered. Theories about Amy's fate diverged sharply. Many believed she was taken from the ship against her will, possibly drugged and moved ashore in Curacao during the early morning hours. Some suspected links to organised trafficking networks operating in the region. A few questioned whether Amy may have chosen to leave the ship voluntarily, but her family and friends consistently rejected this idea. They pointed to her close relationship with them, her plans for the future, and her personal items left behind in the cabin. Royal Caribbean denied wrongdoing, but was criticised for failing to act quickly when Amy was first reported missing. Questions of jurisdiction complicated the investigation. The Rhapsody of the Seas was registered in Liberia, sailing in Caribbean waters, carrying American passengers. Responsibility shifted between Liberian maritime law, local authorities in Curacao, and the FBI. Coordination was slow, and evidence that might have clarified events was never secured. The FBI classified Amy Lynn Bradley as missing and endangered. Her case remains open. Over the years, age progression images have been produced, showing what Amy might look like if alive today. Her story has appeared in congressional hearings on cruise ship safety, alongside the case of George Smith, to highlight the vulnerabilities of passengers in international waters. Amy's mother, Iva, often repeated the words, "Every day I wake up wondering if she's alive, and if she is, where she's being held." For the Bradley family, each potential lead carried both hope and pain. The possibility that Amy had survived was balanced by the fear of what her life might have been since her disappearance. Today, Amy remains listed in the FBI's missing persons database. Her photographs, including the one of her smiling with short hair, continue to circulate. The tattoos she once wore as expressions of personality became markers of identity in the search for her. The questions remain the same as they were in March 1998. How a young woman could vanish from a crowded cruise ship, and whether the sightings that followed were fragments of truth or the echoes of mistaken memory. For her parents, Ron and Eva, the moment of waking in their cabin that morning divided their lives in two. Before, they were a family on holiday. After, they were a family living in a silence that never lifted. The disappearance on the Pearl of Scandinavia. In July 2009, a ferry called the Pearl of Scandinavia sailed overnight from Copenhagen, Denmark to Oslo, Norway. On board were hundreds of passengers making the short journey across the Baltic Sea. Among them was a 28-year-old Swedish man travelling with friends. By morning, he was gone. His disappearance left behind fragments of CCTV footage, unanswered questions, and another entry in the long record of unexplained vanishings at sea. The Pearl of Scandinavia was part of the DFDS Seaways fleet, a company that operated one of the busiest passenger and freight lines in Northern Europe. The ship was not a luxury cruise liner, but it offered comfortable cabins, restaurants, bars, duty-free shopping, and entertainment to those making the crossing. For some, it was a practical mode of transport, connecting capitals separated by water. For others, it was an opportunity for a short holiday at sea. The clientele ranged from families on vacation to commuters and weekend travellers. To most, it was routine. To investigators later, the journey of July 2009 was anything but ordinary. According to accounts, the man had boarded the ferry with several friends. The group enjoyed a typical evening on board, drinking in the lounge, eating and walking the decks. Witnesses described him as cheerful, talking with others, and joking. But as the night went on, he became visibly intoxicated. Ferry staff confirmed he was last seen in the early hours, walking unsteadily along one of the outer decks. Closed-circuit cameras recorded him near the railings, pausing and appearing to lean before moving again. Investigators noted that he seemed unsteady but not disorderly. The footage, however, did not show what happened next. There was no image of him climbing the railing or falling. The last frame simply showed him continuing along the deck, after which he was never seen again. When the ferry docked in Oslo the next morning, his absence was discovered. His cabin was empty. Inside, his wallet, identification and personal belongings remained neatly arranged. His friends became concerned when he did not appear for breakfast. At first, they believed he might still be sleeping, but after knocking repeatedly and finding the room deserted, they reported him missing. Crew members conducted a search of the ship, public announcements were made, and staff checked common areas, but there was no sign of the passenger. The conclusion was reached quickly. He must have gone overboard during the night. The official explanation suggested that intoxication had caused him to lose his balance and fall into the sea. At the time, the Baltic waters averaged around 16 degrees Celsius. Maritime safety guidelines estimated that survival time in such conditions ranged from 1 to 3 hours at most. No alarm had been raised, and no one reported seeing or hearing a fall. By the time authorities were notified, the ferry had already covered many nautical miles. Search and rescue units from both Denmark and Sweden were dispatched, sweeping the waters with helicopters and patrol boats. Despite their efforts, nothing was found. Almost immediately, questions arose about the plausibility of an accidental fall. The railings along the Pearl of Scandinavia measured more than 1 meter in height, high enough to prevent someone from simply stumbling over. They were designed with passenger safety in mind, reflecting international maritime standards. Fellow travellers who had observed the missing man noted that while he had been drunk, he was not reckless. His family later emphasized that he was not known to climb or lean dangerously in such situations. Speculation emerged. Could he have been pushed? Was there an argument or a fight on the deck that had not been captured by cameras? CCTV footage had gaps. It did not provide full coverage of every angle or corridor. Investigators who reviewed the tapes reported that he appeared alone in the final images, but critics pointed out that there were blind spots. Without continuous video, certainty was impossible. The case reached Scandinavian newspapers. Headlines in Denmark, Sweden, and Norway described the incident as a tragedy, but also questioned ferry safety protocols. Editorials noted that while hundreds of thousands travelled these routes safely each year, disappearances were not unheard of. The absence of solid evidence in this case left open-ended questions that fueled public unease. CCTV became central to the discussion. Families of victims in similar cases argued that cameras on passenger ships should provide seamless coverage, particularly of exterior decks. Yet shipping companies pointed to costs and privacy considerations. In this case, the missing passenger's final moments remained undocumented, creating space for theories and speculation. The Pearl of Scandinavia continued operating after the incident, making its regular journeys between Copenhagen and Oslo. Passengers boarded and disembarked without knowledge of the unanswered questions surrounding the man who never arrived at his destination. For his family, however, the absence was permanent. With no body recovered and no eyewitnesses, there was no closure. Ferry disappearances often receive less international coverage than those on larger cruise liners, but they occur with similar frequency. In Northern Europe alone, dozens of passengers vanish from ferries each decade. Official records frequently classify them as accidents or suicides. Very few are investigated in depth, and fewer still are solved. This case became one more entry in that pattern. A man alive and seen walking the deck one moment, gone the next. The official record reads as a likely fall, but the absence of evidence leaves lingering doubts. His family asked repeatedly how a healthy young man could vanish without trace in an environment with surveillance, staff, and hundreds of other passengers. Each time, the answers returned incomplete. The disappearance of the Swedish passenger on the Pearl of Scandinavia remains unresolved. A short overnight voyage across calm waters ended in silence. What began as a social evening with friends concluded as a mystery without witnesses, without recovery, and without explanation. Silent decks of the Sun Vista. In May 1999, the cruise ship Sun Vista sailed through the Strait of Malacca on what should have been an ordinary voyage. The vessel carried more than 1,000 people, passengers and crew on its journey between Singapore and Penang. It was a modern liner by the standards of the time, with restaurants, bars, a swimming pool, and entertainment facilities designed for travellers seeking comfort on the busy route. Yet on the night of May 20, the voyage ended not in routine, but in fire, evacuation, and reports that raised questions still spoken of quietly decades later. At approximately 11:00 p.m, alarms sounded. A fire had broken out deep within the engine room. Crew members attempted to contain it, but smoke spread rapidly through the ship's ventilation system. Passengers recalled confusion in the corridors as staff directed them toward lifeboat stations. Some remembered hearing announcements in multiple languages, while others described only muffled instructions and hurried shouting. The Sun Vista quickly lost power, plunging parts of the vessel into darkness. Emergency lighting flickered in some hallways, but entire sections of the ship became unlit, leaving passengers to move through smoke and shadow. Within hours, the fire spread beyond control. The captain, Knut C. Madland, ordered an evacuation. Lifeboats were lowered into the Strait of Malacca under the dim light of the stars and the glow of the burning ship. More than 1,000 people entered the water in lifeboats, or were rescued by nearby vessels that responded to the distress signal. The evacuation was considered largely successful, with merchant ships and fishing boats converging on the scene through the night. Official records later stated that all passengers and crew survived. The Sun Vista, however, continued to burn until dawn, when she rolled to her side and sank beneath the waves. In the days that followed, the focus shifted from the fire itself to the aftermath. Reports emphasized that there had been no loss of life, presenting the evacuation as a rare success story. But whispers began to circulate among survivors. Some claimed that not all passengers were accounted for. Lists of names released by the company contained small discrepancies, duplicate entries, passengers marked as not boarded, and others listed as disembarked early. For families searching for clarity, these inconsistencies left space for doubt. Confusion also surrounded belongings. When passengers were reunited with recovered luggage, some discovered items missing. Others noted that certain cabins seemed to have been emptied of valuables before the fire grew uncontrollable. The ship had lost power quickly, leaving little time for organized theft. Yet rumors spread that opportunistic looting occurred during the chaotic evacuation. Official statements from the cruise line dismissed these claims, attributing missing items to the disorder of abandoning ship and the likelihood that possessions had burned or sunk with the vessel. Investigators examined the cause of the fire. The final report pointed to an electrical fault in the engine control room as the likely source. Maintenance records were reviewed, and while some irregularities were noted, nothing conclusively suggested sabotage or deliberate negligence. Still, among maritime experts, questions lingered. Fires at sea were not unknown, but the speed with which this blaze spread, coupled with the total loss of power, suggested that fire suppression systems may have failed. Some speculated that routine safety checks had not been properly conducted, leaving weaknesses that were only revealed in crisis. Passengers who had been on board recalled eerie moments during the evacuation. Some reported hearing names called repeatedly by crew members, names that never appeared on later manifests. Others remembered watching small groups of passengers being separated from the larger crowd, guided toward lifeboats by staff who did not return. These accounts were never substantiated, but they persisted in survivor testimonies, forming part of the lore surrounding the sinking. The Strait of Malacca itself added to the uncertainty. As one of the busiest shipping lanes in the world, it was crowded with vessels of all sizes, from cargo freighters to fishing boats. Survivors reported seeing small craft appear quickly after the evacuation began, approaching lifeboats and circling them before vanishing into the dark. The identity of these vessels was never confirmed. Official records stated only that nearby merchant ships responded to the distress signal and assisted with rescue. Whether other boats were present, unnoticed in the confusion, remains unverified. When dawn broke, photographs showed the Sun Vista tilting, flames still visible from her upper decks. By mid-morning, she sank completely, leaving nothing but lifeboats scattered across the strait. Passengers and crew were transported to shore, many arriving in Penang shaken and without their belongings. News coverage emphasized the remarkable survival rate. Newspapers carried images of relieved tourists standing barefoot on docks, clutching blankets and staring back toward the horizon where the ship had disappeared. Yet, behind the headlines, survivors continued to speak of details that did not align. Some swore that a handful of fellow passengers had not been seen again after the evacuation, despite official assurances that all were rescued. Others described luggage that never turned up in inventories, including passports, jewelry, and personal items stored in cabins far from the engine room. Families asked why some passenger names appeared inconsistently on official lists. Each question was met with explanations of clerical error, confusion, or simple oversight. The wreck of the Sun Vista lies beneath the waters of the Strait of Malacca, visited occasionally by divers but rarely discussed in public memory. For maritime history, it is catalogued as a rare case where more than 1,000 people evacuated without confirmed fatalities. But for those who lived through the night, the memory remained sharper and stranger. Some survivors described the fire as a sudden break in an otherwise ordinary night, a moment when the expected rhythm of a voyage turned, without warning, into fear. Others carry the quieter burden of unanswered questions. About passengers whose names were heard but never confirmed, about items that should have been destroyed but were simply gone, about sightings of boats and faces that did not match official accounts. In the end, the sinking of the Sun Vista is remembered as both a triumph of evacuation and a shadowed event, with lingering doubts. Beneath the official record lies another narrative, quieter and less defined, told by those who believe that not every disappearance that night was explained. The mystery of Marion Carver. In August 2004, a woman named Marion Louise Carver boarded the Celebrity Mercury, a cruise ship owned by Celebrity Cruises, for a 7-day voyage from Seattle to Alaska. She was 40 years old, a resident of Cambridge, Massachusetts, and the mother of a teenage daughter. Her family later explained that the trip had been arranged quietly, without their knowledge, which made her sudden disappearance even harder to understand. The Celebrity Mercury departed Seattle on August 27. For most passengers, it was a leisurely escape into the fjords, glaciers, and quiet ports of Alaska. On board were shows, dining rooms, and excursions designed for relaxation. Marion kept to herself. Crew members later testified that she did not attend many public activities, preferring solitude in her stateroom. In the official records, she was registered as a solo traveller. Her cabin steward, Domingo Montero, recalled unusual circumstances. After the first evening, he noticed that her room was not being used in a normal way. The bed remained untouched, and items in the cabin stayed in the same position for days. Montero reported this to his supervisor. According to his later statements, he was told to continue placing the daily newsletter on her bed, but otherwise to leave the matter alone. He followed instructions, though he grew increasingly uneasy. By the time the ship returned to Seattle on September 3, no one had seen Marion Carver for days. She had not been marked as disembarked at any port of call. Her belongings, including clothing and personal items, were still in the cabin. Montero stated that he was pressured to keep quiet, even after he expressed concern. He claimed he was told not to discuss the missing passenger further. Celebrity Cruises did not notify authorities or the Carver family. For weeks after the voyage, no official report was made. It was only when Marion's father, Kendall Carver, began searching for his daughter that the truth surfaced. He had tried calling her after she failed to appear for a scheduled meeting with her daughter. When repeated attempts to reach her failed, he began contacting airlines, hotels, and finally the cruise line. The cruise company initially stated that it had no record of her boarding, then later confirmed that she had taken the voyage. Kendall Carver was stunned to learn that his daughter had vanished during the cruise, and that no one had informed him. He launched his own investigation, hiring private detectives to piece together what had happened on board. Interviews with crew members revealed troubling details. The cabin steward confirmed his suspicions during the voyage and the instructions he had received to remain silent. Other staff members admitted they had heard rumours of a missing woman, but were told the matter was under control. Security footage was not preserved. Passenger lists were not cross-checked in a timely manner. By the time investigators outside the cruise line began asking questions, weeks had passed. The family pressed Celebrity Cruises for answers. The company eventually acknowledged that Marian had been aboard, but maintained that there was no evidence of foul play. Without a body, eyewitness testimony, or clear evidence of an accident, the official position was that her fate could not be determined. For the Carver family, this was unacceptable. Kendall Carver became an outspoken advocate for accountability in the cruise industry. He founded the International Cruise Victims Association, an organization created to give families of missing passengers and crime victims a voice. Through public testimony, media appearances, and congressional hearings, he argued that the cruise industry lacked transparency, failed to report crimes, and often put business interests before passenger safety. The case of Marian Carver was presented before the United States Congress in hearings on maritime safety. Legislators examined the gaps in reporting procedures, the lack of independent oversight, and the ease with which missing persons could vanish from ships without prompt investigation. Marian's story became one of the central examples cited in support of the Cruise Vessel Security and Safety Act of 2010, which introduced stricter requirements for reporting crimes, preserving evidence, and cooperating with law enforcement. Yet despite the legislative changes, Marian's individual case remained unsolved. Her daughter grew up without knowing what had happened. Her father continued to speak publicly, repeating the timeline and the unanswered questions. He emphasized that the issue was not only his daughter's disappearance, but the possibility that other passengers could vanish in the same way, unnoticed or unreported. Among the unanswered questions was the silence of the cruise line during the voyage itself. Why had the steward's concerns not triggered a search of the ship? Why had her belongings remained untouched until disembarkation? Why had her family not been informed immediately? And why had records been inconsistent when Kendall Carver first inquired? Each of these questions highlighted weaknesses in the system. Passengers on board later said they had not heard announcements or appeals for information about a missing woman. To them, the voyage proceeded as usual. Entertainment continued, ports were visited, and meals were served without interruption. In the background, one stateroom remained unused, its occupant unaccounted for. The absence of physical evidence prevented definitive conclusions. Some suggested that Marian may have gone overboard, either by accident or suicide. Others considered the possibility of foul play. Her father rejected any assumption of voluntary disappearance. He pointed to her responsibilities as a mother, her close bond with her daughter, and her plans for the future. The mystery grew beyond the single case. It became a symbol of how cruise ships, operating in international waters, were subject to overlapping jurisdictions and minimal external oversight. A missing passenger could vanish into paperwork delays, unpreserved evidence, and jurisdictional disputes. Marian Carver's disappearance exposed this vulnerability in stark detail. Years later, her father continued his advocacy. In interviews, he described the silence of the cruise line in the weeks after her disappearance as the most painful element. He recalled phoning repeatedly, being told that no information was available, and only later learning that the company had known she was missing since the voyage itself. Today, Marian Carver's name appears in maritime safety reports, congressional transcripts, and missing persons databases. Her case is often included in documentaries and articles about cruise ship disappearances. Yet for her family, it is not a historical example, but a personal void. The Celebrity Mercury continued sailing under different names after the incident, eventually being sold and renamed Mein Schiff II under German ownership, and later Celebrity Mercury again before being retired. The ship's history remains tied to Marian's story, a reminder of a passenger who boarded but never returned. The mystery of Marian Carver endures as one of the most troubling unsolved cases in modern cruise history. It is remembered not only for the disappearance itself, but for what it revealed about the hidden procedures of the industry, where silence and delay could obscure a tragedy at sea. The vanishing of Rebecca Corium. In March 2011, the Disney Wonder, part of the Disney Cruise Line fleet, sailed along the Pacific coast of Mexico. On board was 24-year-old Rebecca Corium, a British woman from Chester, England, employed as a youth counsellor. She had been working at sea for months, responsible for overseeing children's activities in the ship's youth programs. For her family in England, she was thousands of miles from home, but in a job she enjoyed. For investigators later, her disappearance became one of the most widely publicised cases of a crew member vanishing without explanation. Rebecca was described as cheerful, athletic, and dependable. She had studied sports science at college, trained as a youth worker, and was known for her ability to connect with children. Friends and family said she loved travel and had taken the opportunity with Disney to combine work with seeing the world. Photographs from her time on board show her in uniform, smiling with groups of children, part of the large international crew that kept the floating resort running smoothly. On March 21, 2011, Rebecca was last seen on the ship's CCTV cameras. At around 5:45 a.m, footage recorded her in crew areas near the crew pool, wearing men's clothing, a pair of men's shorts and a staff t-shirt. She was speaking on an internal phone. According to reports, she appeared upset during the call. The footage then showed her tucking her hair behind her ears and walking away. She was never seen again. By the time she failed to report for her morning shift, concern began to spread among staff. Searches of the ship were carried out, but no trace of her was found. Her key card, which tracked movements around crew access doors, was not used again. Her personal belongings, including her passport and possessions, remained in her cabin. The official explanation provided later suggested that Rebecca may have been swept overboard by a rogue wave while walking on an open deck. Disney Cruise Line stated that it was the most likely scenario, though no footage captured such an event. Family members, however, questioned this theory. They argued that the decks had high railings and the ship was not experiencing extreme weather conditions at the time. For them, the idea that she had accidentally fallen seemed improbable. Jurisdiction complicated the investigation. The Disney Wonder was registered in the Bahamas, and under maritime law, the Bahamian authorities held primary responsibility for inquiries. A single Bahamian investigator flew to the ship once it docked in Los Angeles. He reportedly spent only one day on board before leaving. This brief presence frustrated Rebecca's family, who felt that the investigation was neither thorough nor independent. In the weeks after her disappearance, Rebecca's parents, Mike and Ann Corium, travelled to the United States seeking answers. They met with Disney representatives and attempted to retrace her last movements. They later described being shown only a short segment of the CCTV footage, carefully chosen and limited. No extended review of the ship's cameras was offered. The family felt that crucial evidence had not been disclosed. Speculation about Rebecca's fate grew. Some believed she had taken her own life, citing the distressed phone call as a possible indicator. Others argued that she may have been involved in an accident or foul play within crew-only areas, beyond the view of passengers. Rumours circulated among crew members, some suggesting personal conflicts or relationships that may have played a role. None of these stories were ever substantiated. The case attracted significant media coverage in Britain. News outlets highlighted the lack of transparency in the investigation and the restricted role of Bahamian authorities. The Corium family appeared on national television, emphasising their belief that more information was being withheld. Members of Parliament raised the issue in the House of Commons, pointing to flaws in how cruise ship incidents were handled internationally. Maritime safety advocates also used Rebecca's case to illustrate broader concerns. The overlap of jurisdictions, the control of information by cruise companies, and the limited scope of external investigations left families without clear answers. In testimony to the media, Kendall Carver of the International Cruise Victims Association, whose daughter Marian had disappeared years earlier, connected the two cases as examples of systemic failures. Disney Cruise Line maintained that it had cooperated fully with authorities and expressed sympathy for the family. Still, the perception that the company controlled access to evidence persisted. The CCTV footage remained unseen by the public, and details about the distressed phone call were never fully disclosed. For Rebecca's parents, the unanswered questions lingered. They traveled to Los Angeles and met with the Bahamian investigator, but no new information emerged. They later said that the lack of clarity was more difficult than any definitive outcome would have been. In interviews, they emphasized their belief that their daughter had not simply been swept overboard unnoticed. Over time, Rebecca's disappearance became one of the most cited examples in discussions of crew safety at sea. Unlike passengers, whose disappearances sometimes drew media attention, crew members were often less visible. Rebecca's case demonstrated that even employees working in structured environments could vanish without resolution. Today, her name remains listed among open cases of missing persons at sea. Her family continues to seek answers, though more than a decade has passed since her disappearance. The questions remain: what happened after she walked away from the crew phone? Why only a fragment of footage was shown? And whether more could have been done to uncover the truth. For passengers on the Disney Wonder that week, the voyage continued. Meals were served, entertainment resumed, and ports of call were visited. Yet for the Corium family, March 21, 2011, was a day that ended not with routine, but with silence, and a daughter who never came home. The case of Angelo Faliva. In November 2009, the Coral Princess, a cruise ship operated by Princess Cruises, sailed through the waters between Aruba and Cartagena, Colombia. On board was 31-year-old Angelo Faliva, an Italian national working as a chef. He had been with the company for several years and was well liked among both crew and passengers who knew him. Colleagues later described him as outgoing, professional, and passionate about his work. Yet on November 25, he vanished during what should have been a routine shift change, leaving behind no trace. The Coral Princess was part of the massive Princess Cruises fleet, designed for long voyages through the Caribbean and South America. It carried thousands of passengers and a large international crew, each performing tasks that kept the floating hotel running. Angelo had worked his way up in the kitchens, responsible for preparing meals on a ship where dining was one of the central attractions. For many passengers, the food service was seamless, with courses arriving on time and menus shifting daily. Behind the scenes, however, the galley was a demanding workplace, where long hours and tight schedules were the norm. Angelo was last seen during the busy hours of meal preparation, a time when crew members moved quickly between stations. Witnesses recalled him leaving the galley shortly after 8:00 p.m. He appeared calm and gave no indication that anything was wrong. His uniform was clean, and he carried nothing unusual. From there, he was expected to return to his duties, but he never did. When he failed to appear at his next shift, colleagues began to worry. A search of crew areas and common spaces produced nothing. His cabin was checked. Inside, his belongings, passport, and personal items were all in place. His bunk was tidy, and nothing suggested he had packed to leave. There was no note, no message, and no explanation. The absence of evidence was immediate and total. The official assumption was that Angelo may have gone overboard. On cruise ships, this explanation is common, though rarely supported by witnesses. Ships in motion make recovery nearly impossible, especially if hours pass before anyone notices. Yet questions quickly arose. The Coral Princess was equipped with cameras in public passenger areas, but coverage in crew-only sections was less complete. No footage ever surfaced to show Angelo's movements after he left the galley. Without that, investigators could not confirm whether he had fallen, jumped, or been forced. For his family in Italy, the news was devastating. They had last spoken to him days earlier, and he had described normal routines. He had mentioned plans for his upcoming leave, including spending time with his sister and friends at home. Nothing in his words suggested distress. His sister, Chiara, became the family's spokesperson. She rejected the idea that he had chosen to disappear voluntarily. She described her brother as happy in his work, deeply connected to his family, and looking forward to his next visit home. When the disappearance was formally reported, jurisdiction fell to the Panamanian authorities, as the ship was registered in Panama. This immediately created complications. Local officials had limited capacity to conduct a thorough investigation. Princess Cruises retained control of the vessel, its records, and its crew. Angelo's family later said they felt excluded from the process, receiving little information beyond the standard statement that he was presumed overboard. Crew members described a tense atmosphere in the days following. Some recalled hearing rumours that Angelo had argued with others on board in the days leading up to his disappearance, though nothing was confirmed. Others suggested he may have seen something he should not have seen, perhaps in crew-only areas. None of these stories were substantiated, but they circulated among staff, deepening unease. Searches were conducted in the surrounding waters, but no body was ever recovered. The Caribbean currents made recovery unlikely, especially if several hours had passed before his absence was noticed. The lack of physical evidence left every possibility open, from accident to suicide to foul play. Italian newspapers reported extensively on the case. Headlines emphasized the gaps in communication between Princess Cruises, Panamanian investigators, and the Faliva family. Editorials asked how a crew member could vanish from a controlled environment with thousands of people aboard. The absence of CCTV footage was highlighted repeatedly. For the family, the lack of answers compounded the loss, creating an endless uncertainty. Over time, the case of Angelo Faliva became one of the most cited examples of crew disappearances at sea. Advocates for maritime safety used it to illustrate how vulnerable crew members were, even as they worked in what should have been a structured and supervised environment. His case joined others in public testimony before legislatures, reinforcing demands for stronger safety and reporting requirements. Princess Cruises maintained that it had cooperated with authorities. Company representatives pointed to jurisdictional boundaries, emphasizing that the investigation was led by Panamanian officials. Critics, however, argued that too much control rested with the cruise companies themselves. With ships often registered under foreign flags, investigations fell to jurisdictions far from where the families lived. This led to slow communication, limited transparency, and unresolved grief. For the Faliva family, the unanswered questions never faded. Chiara described their situation as one of limbo without evidence. They could not know whether Angelo was alive or dead. They pressed for more information, but received little in return. In interviews, they explained that the hardest part was the silence, a disappearance without explanation, a life that ended in uncertainty. The Coral Princess continues to sail under the Princess brand, carrying thousands of passengers on voyages across the Americas. To most travellers, it is a vessel of leisure, with shows, buffets, and shore excursions. Yet for one family in Cremona, Italy, it is remembered as the last place their son and brother was seen alive. The case of Angelo Faliva endures as a reminder of how easily individuals can vanish in the confined, structured world of a cruise ship. It is remembered not only as a personal tragedy, but also as evidence of broader systemic flaws, jurisdictions that blur, investigations that stall, and records that fail to provide answers. Today, Angelo's name remains on lists of missing persons at sea. His story is repeated in reports, documentaries, and advocacy campaigns for maritime safety. For his family, the years have passed without resolution. The silence of November 25, 2009 continues. The disappearance of John Halford. In January 2011, the Thompson Spirit, a cruise ship operated by Thompson Cruises, concluded a Mediterranean voyage that had taken passengers through ports in Egypt, Israel, and Cyprus. On board was 63-year-old John Halford, a British man from Milton Keynes. He was a father of two, a retired teacher, and someone who had travelled before. This cruise was meant to be a winter escape, a chance to enjoy warmer weather during the cold months of England. Yet on the final night of the voyage, he vanished, leaving behind only a suitcase placed neatly outside his cabin door. The Thompson Spirit was a mid-sized vessel, carrying fewer passengers than the largest cruise liners, but still offering restaurants, lounges, and evening entertainment. It was nearing the end of its journey when John disappeared. On the last night, passengers were preparing for disembarkation in Limassol, Cyprus. Following the usual procedure, they packed their bags and set them in the corridor to be collected by staff. John did the same. His suitcase was later found among the others, labelled and ready. But when the ship docked and passengers disembarked, he was not among them. Fellow travellers recalled seeing John the evening before. He had spoken with other passengers, shared casual conversations, and attended some of the ship's final events. Those who saw him described him as calm, polite, and showing no signs of distress. Crew records showed nothing unusual. His cabin was tidy, with his belongings carefully arranged. Everything about the scene suggested routine, except for the fact that John himself was missing. When he did not disembark, crew members began a systematic search of the vessel. Public areas were checked, from the lounges to the open decks. Announcements were made, requesting that he contact the reception desk. No reply came. After further inspection, the conclusion was reached quickly. John Halford was no longer on board. Authorities in Cyprus were notified, and the assumption was that he had gone overboard during the night. The Mediterranean waters in January are cold, with temperatures low enough to make survival difficult. Experts estimated that without immediate rescue, survival time would have been measured in only a few hours. No one had witnessed a fall. No alarm had been triggered. No CCTV footage was released to show his movements after he was last seen. The absence of evidence left his fate uncertain. For his family in Britain, the news was almost impossible to accept. John had spoken to them during the cruise, describing the ports he had visited and the experiences he enjoyed. He told them about excursions, about the atmosphere on the ship, and about his plans for when he returned home. His daughter, Kate, later explained that her father had been in good spirits and was looking forward to seeing his family. To them, there was no sign of despair, no indication of an intention to disappear. Questions emerged immediately. How could a man vanish from a ship carrying hundreds of passengers and crew? Why had no one witnessed his movements during the night? Why had cameras not captured anything conclusive? Could he have gone onto an outer deck during the late hours and fallen unnoticed? Or had something else happened that remained undiscovered? Authorities in Cyprus opened an inquiry, but jurisdiction quickly became complicated. The Thompson Spirit was registered in Malta, giving Maltese officials the formal lead. At the same time, Cypriot investigators and British consular staff became involved. The overlapping responsibilities slowed progress. Information was not always shared directly with the family. No conclusive evidence was ever gathered, and the official record remained limited. For the Halford family, the silence became the hardest part. Without a body, there was no closure. Without reliable records, there was no certainty. His suitcase, standing neatly in the corridor alongside dozens of others, remained the only tangible reminder of his presence on the voyage. Passengers remembered seeing it there in the early morning, waiting to be collected for disembarkation, a suitcase without an owner. The case drew attention in British newspapers. Reports emphasized the strangeness of a man who had packed his bags for home but never returned. Some headlines framed it as a disappearance without trace, while others questioned the safety of passengers on board modern cruise ships. Editorials asked how such events could happen without immediate explanation, in an environment thought to be secure and closely monitored. In the years since, John Halford's disappearance has often been cited alongside other cases of passengers vanishing on the final night of cruises. Maritime experts note that the last evening is frequently chaotic. Passengers stay up later than usual, luggage fills the corridors, and crew members focus on disembarkation procedures. In such conditions, gaps in observation are common. Yet for John's family, this explanation did not provide comfort. It was a pattern, but it was not an answer. Today, John remains listed as missing at sea. His family continues to remember him as a devoted father and grandfather, a man whose life ended not with clear resolution, but with uncertainty. The Thompson Spirit went on to complete other voyages, its decks cleaned and its cabins filled with new travellers. For most, it was simply another holiday ship. For one family in England, however, it is remembered as the last place their father was seen. The disappearance of John Halford endures as another unresolved case in maritime history. It remains defined by silence. A suitcase in a corridor, a passenger not disembarking, and the absence of evidence that could explain what happened between nightfall and morning. The unsolved case of Annette Mizener. In December 2004, the Carnival Pride, a cruise ship operated by Carnival Cruise Lines, returned from a 7-day Mexican Riviera voyage to its home port of Los Angeles. On board was 37-year-old Annette Mizener, a mother of 3 from Waukesha, Wisconsin. She had embarked on the cruise with her parents and friends, looking forward to time away from routine life. But on December 4, just hours before the voyage was scheduled to end, Annette vanished. Her handbag was found near a railing on one of the upper decks. Inside were her identification, camera, lipstick, and personal items. She was gone. The Carnival Pride carried more than 100 passengers and nearly 900 crew members. With multiple decks, pools, restaurants, and entertainment venues, it was a typical floating resort of its era. The final evening of a cruise is often busy, with passengers finishing their packing, attending farewell dinners, or watching the last shows before returning to port. For most, the night was filled with preparation and anticipation of returning home. For Annette, however, the night ended in silence and uncertainty. Around 9:00 p.m., her handbag was discovered on Deck 9, placed near a railing overlooking the sea. The area was not hidden, but part of a walkway used by passengers moving between venues. Surveillance cameras were positioned nearby, but later reports suggested that none captured clear footage of her final moments. Her belongings were neatly arranged, leading investigators to believe they had not been dropped accidentally. The careful placement raised more questions than it answered. When Annette did not return to her cabin, her parents became concerned. They notified crew members, and a ship-wide search was initiated. Announcements were made, and public areas were inspected. Her stateroom revealed no signs of disturbance. Her luggage, packed for disembarkation, was ready outside the door along with those of other passengers. Yet Annette herself was nowhere to be found. The assumption, reached quickly by officials on board, was that she had gone overboard. The ship slowed its progress, and search efforts began. The U.S. Coast Guard was alerted and deployed both aircraft and vessels to scan the waters. Over the next hours, the search extended across more than 300 square miles of the Pacific. Despite the scale of the operation, no trace of her was ever recovered. For Annette's family, the suddenness was overwhelming. She had been seen earlier in the evening, talking with her parents and friends. Nothing in her demeanor suggested distress. Her father, Lawrence, later stated that she had been in good spirits, excited about returning home to Wisconsin, and already talking about her plans after the trip. The idea that she had chosen to end her life seemed unthinkable to those closest to her. Speculation, however, grew quickly. Some suggested suicide, pointing to the positioning of her handbag and the lack of witnesses. Others considered the possibility of foul play. Her handbag contained valuables, yet nothing was missing, leading some to believe the scene had been staged. Passengers whispered that she may have been followed or confronted before her disappearance. Without reliable footage or eyewitnesses, these possibilities could neither be confirmed nor dismissed. Jurisdiction complicated the matter. The Carnival Pride was registered in Panama, sailing in international waters, but docking in the United States. The FBI assumed jurisdiction once the ship returned to Los Angeles. Investigators interviewed family members, fellow passengers, and crew. They collected the handbag, reviewed her cabin, and checked her travel documents. Yet no evidence emerged to explain what had happened. Forensic experts considered whether she might have fallen accidentally. The railings on Deck 9 were higher than waist level, designed to prevent such accidents. To fall, she would have had to lean deliberately, climb, or be forced. The lack of scratches or disturbance around the railing suggested no struggle. The absence of any physical evidence left only competing theories. The media reported widely on the case. Headlines across the United States described it as another unsolved cruise disappearance. Television programs featured interviews with her parents, who pleaded for answers. Annette's 3 children were left with questions that could not be resolved. Public attention brought sympathy, but it did not bring clarity. Cruise safety advocates used the case to highlight shortcomings in the industry. The lack of complete CCTV coverage, the reliance on flag state jurisdictions, and the limited transparency of investigations were all emphasized as barriers to justice. Annette's case was often cited alongside other disappearances, such as those of George Smith and Marion Carver, in congressional hearings on maritime safety. In later years, her name was mentioned in connection with the Cruise Vessel Security and Safety Act of 2010, passed 6 years after her disappearance. The law required cruise lines docking at U.S. ports to improve surveillance, crime reporting, and evidence preservation. But in 2004, no such framework was in place. For Annette's family, the timing meant that her case was left unresolved, trapped in a period when oversight was minimal. For her family and friends, the memory of Annette is more than the case file. She was a mother, daughter, and companion. Photographs show her smiling with her children, celebrating birthdays and holidays. To them, her absence is not just an example of maritime risk, but a personal loss that has endured for decades. Today, the Carnival Pride continues to operate, carrying thousands of passengers on Caribbean and Atlantic routes. To most, it is simply another ship in Carnival's fleet, offering entertainment and leisure. But for one family in Wisconsin, it will always be remembered as the ship where a loved one disappeared into silence, leaving behind a handbag and questions that will never fully be answered. The disappearance of Annette Mizner remains one of the unsolved cases in cruise ship history. It is remembered not by evidence, but by absence, an unfinished story of a mother who boarded a ship and never walked off again. Reported sightings of Amy Lynn Bradley. In March 1998, Amy Lynn Bradley disappeared from the Rhapsody of the Seas while the ship sailed near Curacao. She was 23 years old, travelling with her parents and brother on a Caribbean cruise. Despite immediate searches on board and in surrounding waters, no trace of her was found. Her belongings, including her shoes and cigarettes, were left behind on the balcony of her cabin. In the days and years that followed, reports of sightings across the Caribbean kept her case alive. These alleged encounters, though never confirmed, fueled speculation that she had been abducted and forced into trafficking networks. The first reported sighting came on the morning she vanished. Witnesses claimed they saw a young woman resembling Amy being led off the ship in Curaçao into a waiting car. She was described as appearing disoriented, as though under stress or confusion. The testimony could not be verified, and investigators noted that cruise ports are crowded with passengers disembarking at the same time. Yet the account became the foundation of one of the leading theories, that Amy had been taken ashore against her will before her absence was fully noticed. Later, in 1998, 2 Canadian tourists vacationing in Curaçao reported seeing a woman on the beach who strongly resembled Amy. They said she was accompanied by several men who seemed to be watching her closely. The woman, they recalled, looked distressed. At the time they did not intervene, uncertain about what they were witnessing. Only after they returned home and learned about Amy's disappearance did they contact authorities. Their statements added weight to the idea that she may have been alive and being held against her will. In 1999, a particularly disturbing account emerged. A U.S. Navy petty officer reported that he had visited a brothel in Curaçao, where a young woman approached him and told him her name was Amy Bradley. She begged for help. The petty officer later said he did not act immediately, fearing for his safety in a volatile environment. By the time he alerted his superiors, the brothel had been emptied. No sign of the woman remained. Although the account could never be verified, it became one of the most widely discussed pieces of testimony connected to her case. For the Bradley family, each of these reports carried a heavy weight. Her mother, Iva, explained in interviews that every claim of a sighting forced them into a cycle of hope and despair. "Every day I wake up wondering if she's alive, and if she is, where she's being held," she said. The possibility that Amy was alive somewhere, perhaps within reach, haunted the family for years. In 2005, new attention came when photographs surfaced online as part of an escort advertisement. The images showed a woman whose tattoos closely resembled Amy's distinctive body art: a Tasmanian devil spinning a basketball on her shoulder, a sun design on her lower back, and a green gecko on her stomach. Forensic experts reviewed the photographs. Some believed the similarities were too close to dismiss. Others argued that the images were inconclusive. Still, the photographs circulated widely, renewing public interest in the case. Other alleged sightings followed in the 2000s. A taxi driver in Curaçao reported picking up a young woman who matched Amy's description. She appeared nervous and asked where the nearest phone was located. An American tourist later reported seeing a woman with similar tattoos shopping in a department store, accompanied by several men. None of these accounts led to direct confirmation, but together they created a pattern that was different from many other cruise ship disappearances. The theory of human trafficking gained traction. Advocates for victims pointed out that young women in tourist regions could be abducted and forced into networks that moved them between islands. The Caribbean, with its steady stream of international visitors and ports, created conditions where such crimes could occur with limited oversight. Amy's disappearance, combined with multiple reported sightings, suggested that she might have become a victim of such a network. Authorities investigated leads as they surfaced, but no recovery was ever made. Jurisdiction complicated every step. The Rhapsody of the Seas was registered in Liberia, Amy was an American citizen, and most sightings were reported in Curaçao and other Caribbean islands. Coordination between local police, the FBI, and international agencies was slow, often hindered by distance, overlapping authority, and the time lag between a sighting and its report. The Bradley family worked tirelessly to keep her case in the public eye. They appeared on America's Most Wanted, Oprah, and other programs, hoping renewed attention would prompt someone to come forward with verifiable information. They distributed flyers, consulted private investigators, and followed up on tips at their own expense. Each potential lead forced them into the emotional strain of weighing evidence against disappointment. For investigators, the challenge lay in separating credible reports from mistaken identity. In tourist destinations, it was possible for someone resembling Amy to be seen and misidentified. Yet the consistency of accounts, especially those describing her tattoos, kept the theory of survival alive. Unlike many missing person cases at sea, where the trail ended in open water, Amy's story unfolded in fragments across land, with potential witnesses describing her in places where she could not be definitively ruled out. Today, Amy Lynn Bradley remains officially listed as missing. The FBI classifies her as missing and endangered. Age progression photographs have been released to show what she might look like decades later, should she still be alive. Her parents continue to speak publicly, emphasizing that her case represents not just their personal loss, but also the vulnerabilities of passengers who vanish from cruise ships without resolution. The reported sightings of Amy remain among the most unusual aspects of maritime disappearances. While most cases end with no trace and no suggestion of survival, Amy's story is marked by accounts that stretched on for years after the morning she vanished. Whether these sightings were genuine or cases of mistaken identity may never be known, but they kept alive the possibility that she did not die at sea, that her disappearance was not final on the ship's balcony, but instead the beginning of a different, hidden life in places far from home. The disappearance of George Smith IV. In July 2005, the Brilliance of the Seas, a Royal Caribbean cruise liner, sailed through the Aegean Sea on a 12-day Mediterranean voyage. Among the passengers was 26-year-old George Allen Smith IV of Greenwich, Connecticut. He was travelling on his honeymoon with his new wife, Jennifer Hagel. For their families, it was a moment of celebration. Photographs taken during the early days of the cruise showed them smiling, blending into the rhythm of dining rooms, onshore excursions, and evenings at sea. Yet by the morning of July 5th, George Smith had vanished. What followed was one of the most scrutinised disappearances in cruise ship history, marked by bloodstains, conflicting testimony, and international investigations. On the night of July 4, George and Jennifer were seen in the ship's casino. Surveillance footage captured them gambling, speaking with fellow passengers, and drinking. Witnesses later described them as happy, but noted that both had consumed alcohol heavily. After leaving the casino, the couple spent time with a group of young men, several of them Russian nationals, who would later become central figures in the inquiry. By the early hours of July 5, accounts grew less certain. Testimony suggested that George and Jennifer returned to their cabins separately. Jennifer was later found asleep in a corridor outside another passenger's cabin, disoriented and confused. Crew members guided her to an empty stateroom where she spent the night. George, however, never reappeared. At approximately 4:30 a.m., passengers in the cabin directly below the Smiths' balcony reported hearing loud noises and possible commotion above. Not long afterward, they noticed a large bloodstain smeared across the canvas awning that covered their balcony. When crew members entered George and Jennifer's stateroom later that morning, they found more traces of blood inside. The bed appeared slept in. His clothing, wallet, and identification were still present. George himself was gone. The official explanation put forward was that George had fallen from his balcony into the sea, but the evidence did not fit easily with an accident. The railings were high, designed to prevent falls. Forensic specialists noted that the pattern of blood suggested more than a simple slip. Witnesses recalled hearing raised voices near the cabin in the hours before his disappearance. Members of the group of men who had spent time with George were overheard making comments later interpreted as boasting. Jurisdiction complicated the matter. The Brilliance of the Seas was registered in the Bahamas, was sailing in international waters near Greece and Turkey and carried an American citizen who had disappeared. The FBI became involved once the ship docked in Piraeus, Greece, but Greek authorities also interviewed passengers and crew. Testimonies were taken, records were examined, and physical evidence was collected. Yet no charges were ever filed. Jennifer Hagel later accepted a financial settlement from Royal Caribbean Cruises, reportedly exceeding $1 million. In return, she agreed to end legal claims against the company. She explained that the settlement would help preserve George's memory and contribute to raising awareness about passenger safety. George's family, however, remained unconvinced. They were vocal in their belief that foul play had occurred and sharply criticized the cruise line's handling of the incident, the preservation of evidence, and what they described as deliberate avoidance of accountability. The case received widespread media attention. Outlets such as Dateline NBC and CNN devoted hours of programming to it. Reporters interviewed family members, maritime experts, and legal analysts. Central to the coverage were the unanswered questions. How could a healthy young man vanish from his cabin balcony? Why were bloodstains visible both inside the stateroom and on the canopy below? And what role did the men last seen with George play in the night's events? Forensic reports deepened the sense of mystery. Analysts observed that the distribution of blood suggested movement or struggle before the fall, yet without witnesses, a confession, or a recovered body, investigators could not establish a definitive narrative. Searches of the Aegean waters yielded nothing. George's remains were never found. In the years that followed, the disappearance of George Smith became a focal point in public discussions about cruise ship safety. His family testified before the US Congress, urging stronger protections for passengers. They highlighted the lack of consistent security measures, the limitations of international jurisdiction, and the need for mandatory reporting of crimes at sea. Their advocacy, combined with other cases, contributed to the passage of the Cruise Vessel Security and Safety Act of 2010. The law required ships docking at US ports to improve surveillance systems, report crimes promptly, and cooperate more fully with law enforcement. Yet George's individual case remained unresolved. Theories circulated. Some believed that he had been the victim of foul play, possibly during an altercation in his cabin. Others speculated that intoxication had led to a tragic accident. A smaller group suggested that robbery might have been a motive, though his valuables remained in the room. None of these explanations could be proven. For Jennifer Hagel, life moved forward in the shadow of public scrutiny. For George's parents and sister, the absence remained. They continued to press for answers, maintaining that inconsistencies in the record had never been adequately explained. Nearly 2 decades later, the case is still referenced whenever questions of passenger safety at sea arise. It stands as one of the most high-profile disappearances in maritime history, not only because of the mystery itself, but because of what it revealed about the gaps in oversight and accountability on modern cruise ships. The night of July 4 into the morning of July 5, 2005, remains frozen in uncertainty. A young man on his honeymoon vanished under circumstances that defied simple explanation. His belongings remained in order, his bed unmade, his blood visible to those below. But George Smith himself was gone. For one family, the voyage that was meant to mark a beginning became an ending without answers, a story written in fragments that have never been pieced together. Silent decks of the Sun Vista. In May 1999, the Sun Vista, a cruise ship operated by Cruise Holdings, sailed through the Strait of Malacca on what should have been a routine voyage between Singapore and Penang. On board were more than 1,000 passengers and crew. The vessel was equipped with restaurants, bars, lounges, and a swimming pool, modern amenities for its time, designed to appeal to both tourists and frequent travellers in the busy waters of Southeast Asia. For most, the trip was expected to pass like so many others before it, marked only by meals, entertainment, and the gentle rhythm of the sea. On the night of May 20, however, the voyage shifted from normality to emergency when fire broke out deep within the engine room. Hours later, the ship was gone, leaving behind fragments of memory and a story that has never been fully aligned in official and personal accounts. At approximately 11:00 p.m., alarms began to sound throughout the vessel. Passengers reported smelling smoke in corridors. Soon after, they saw it spreading quickly through the ventilation system, moving faster than expected. Crew members attempted to contain the blaze, but the fire advanced beyond their control. Some survivors later recalled announcements in multiple languages directing them toward lifeboat stations. Others remembered little more than muffled commands, confusion in stairwells, and hurried crew moving through hallways. Within minutes, the ship began to lose power. Large portions of the vessel were plunged into darkness. Lights failed, leaving staircases and passageways illuminated only by the occasional emergency fixture or handheld flashlight. The fire intensified. By midnight, the situation was no longer manageable. The captain ordered evacuation. Passengers moved toward lifeboats in a mix of silence and panic. Some survivors described the atmosphere as strangely quiet, punctuated only by sudden bursts of shouting and the sounds of equipment being lowered into the sea. The glow of flames rose against the night sky, reflected in the water of the strait. Lifeboats entered the dark sea, filled with passengers and crew. Many remembered the smell of burning materials, the taste of smoke, and the unsettling vastness of the water around them. More than 1,000 people left the vessel in lifeboats and rafts. Merchant ships in the area responded to the distress calls, diverting to assist in the rescue. Survivors were picked up throughout the night. By dawn, the Sun Vista, engulfed in fire, rolled heavily to one side and slipped beneath the surface of the Strait of Malacca. Official reports praised the evacuation. They emphasized that all passengers and crew had been accounted for, with no confirmed fatalities. In the record of maritime disasters, it was considered a rare achievement. Yet among those who lived through the event, questions lingered. Some passengers quietly insisted that not everyone had been included in the tallies. Manifests contained small discrepancies, duplicate names, notations of disembarked early, and entries marked as not boarded. Families searching for clarity found the paperwork confusing. In later interviews, a few survivors suggested that certain individuals may have disappeared in the chaos, their absence unacknowledged in official summaries. Another source of unease arose when belongings were returned. Some passengers discovered that valuables were missing. Others believed their cabins had been entered before the fire spread widely, though it was unclear how this would have been possible given the loss of power and the urgency of evacuation. The cruise company explained missing items as the natural result of disorder during abandonment of the ship. Still, rumours circulated of theft in the final hours before the vessel was lost. Investigators examined the cause of the fire. Their final report concluded that an electrical fault in the engine control room was responsible. Maintenance records showed irregularities, though not enough to prove negligence or sabotage. Maritime safety specialists noted, however, the rapid escalation of the blaze as unusual. Well-maintained systems are expected to slow the spread of fire, allowing for greater control. In the case of the Sun Vista, darkness and smoke overtook the ship with alarming speed, raising doubts about the condition of its safety equipment. Passengers recalled moments that added to speculation. Some claimed to have heard crew members repeatedly calling out names that did not appear on the official passenger list. Others described seeing small groups of people guided toward lifeboats by staff, only to disappear from view without being recorded later among survivors. These accounts were never verified, but became part of the unofficial history of the disaster, passed on in quiet retellings. The location of the sinking added yet another layer of mystery. The Strait of Malacca is one of the busiest shipping lanes in the world. traversed daily by hundreds of vessels. Survivors reported seeing small, unmarked craft circling the lifeboats during the night. Some recalled these boats approaching closely before pulling away again. Their presence was never explained. Official accounts listed only merchant ships that had responded to the distress call and assisted in rescue. The smaller craft, if they existed, went undocumented. By morning, the Sun Vista was gone. Her wreck now rests beneath the strait, sometimes visited by divers, but mostly forgotten by the travelling public. Maritime history records the event as an example of successful evacuation, with more than 1,000 lives preserved despite catastrophic fire. For survivors, however, memories remain complicated. Many describe it as a sudden rupture in an otherwise ordinary evening, a break in routine that arrived without warning. Others emphasize the unanswered questions about passenger lists, missing belongings, and the extraordinary speed with which the ship succumbed. In the years since, the story of the Sun Vista has been cited in debates about maritime safety, particularly regarding fire prevention and emergency procedures. Its official record highlights the absence of confirmed deaths, yet within personal testimonies, there exists another narrative, one of inconsistencies, suspicions, and details that resist explanation. The sinking of the Sun Vista is remembered not only for the flames that consumed her decks, but also for the silence that followed. A ship carrying more than 1,000 people vanished beneath one of the world's busiest sea lanes, leaving survivors in lifeboats to watch the glow fade from the horizon. What happened during those hours of evacuation remains partly obscured, recorded less in official documents than in fragments of memory and questions that endure. These stories remind us that the sea is not only vast but silent. Cruise ships are places of leisure, filled with shows, dinners, and laughter. Yet behind the music and the light, there are shadows cases that remain open, questions without resolution, and names that never reached the ports written on their tickets. The mysteries we have explored are not solved. They are pauses in history, marked by absence. Families continue to wait, answers remain hidden, and the records end only with the word missing. If you found these disappearances unsettling, thought-provoking, or strangely familiar, you are not alone. The ocean has many such stories, each quiet, each unresolved. Join us again as we continue to uncover the vanishings, the forgotten histories, and the mysteries that still move silently across the water. Subscribe to the channel, share this video, and stay with us. There are more quiet truths still to come.